I never thought I'd be hanging here on the edge of life and death, trying to piece together what the hell just happened. My mind is foggy, my body screams with pain, but one thought cuts through it all like a knife: this wasn't an accident. I'd been set up. And it wasn't just anyone. No, the people I could trust most, they're the ones who did this. Lydia. My Lydia. The woman I loved more than my own life, the woman I was ready to marry. I keep replaying the way she looked at me that last time I saw her, right before. Before all of this. That look. It wasn't warmth or love, not even indifference. It was something cold, calculated. Like I was nothing but a pawn in her game. But it wasn't just her. No, she wasn't acting alone. I remember pieces, little moments that start to connect, all pointing to Eleanor, my stepmother. She'd always lingered at the edges, like some poisonous shadow in the corner of my life. And Robert, my stepbrother, I got he was my friend. Or maybe I just wanted a brother so badly, I blinded myself to the truth. All of them working together. For what? For the money, the estate. It all starts to make a sick kind of sense. My father's legacy, everything he left for me, they wanted it. And the easiest way to get it was to get rid of me. I remember the day Eleanor entered my life like it was yesterday. My father had always been a strong, steadfast man, the type who commanded respect in every room he walked into. After my mother passed, he became quieter, maybe lonelier than I wanted to admit. And then one day, he introduced us to Eleanor. She was stunning, poised, and had this warmth to her, or at least she pretended to. Her charm was undeniable, and it wasn't hard to see why my father was drawn to her. I wanted to trust her too. I wanted to believe that she could bring some life back into our family, that she could make my father happy again. So, I opened up to her, tried to welcome her, to give her a place in our lives. Then came Robert, her son. Around my age, with an easy smile and that instant friendliness that put you at ease. At first, I thought maybe he'd be the brother I never had. We'd even laugh together, go out once in a while. I thought things might actually work out. But looking back now, I realize it was all a game, a careful act they played out perfectly. They slipped into our lives, little by little. Eleanor showered my father with affection, filled the house with laughter, with charm. I thought she was saving us when really she was sinking her claws deeper. And Robert. He mirrored it all, the friendliness, the camaraderie. Only now do I see that glint in his eyes for what it really was. By the time my father fell ill, it was as if they had completely taken over. Eleanor had her hands in every aspect of his life, making decisions for his own good, she would say. Robert was always around too, right by her side. I didn't realize then, but they were positioning themselves perfectly, wrapping my father up in their web until he trusted them more than anyone else. Thinking back on it all, it's painfully clear how Eleanor and Robert wove themselves into our lives, taking up space until there was almost no room left for anyone else. They became this weight, something dark and cold, subtly creeping into every corner of my father's world and mine. I guess that's why meeting Lydia felt like such a relief, like a chance to breathe again. Just when I felt like I was drowning under Eleanor's influence, Lydia appeared, bright and effortless like the first warm day after a long winter. I still remember the night we met. It was at a charity event, one of those high society affairs my father always urged me to attend, saying it was important for the family's reputation. I didn't want to go. I was tired of the show of smiling politely while Eleanor and Robert basked in my father's attention. But the moment I saw her across the room, I felt like something had shifted. She was standing by the bar, elegantly dressed in emerald green, looking out over the crowd with this quiet confidence, as though she was completely comfortable being alone in a room full of strangers. I was drawn to her, and before I knew it, I was standing beside her, introducing myself. She looked up at me with those striking green eyes, and when she smiled, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a spark of hope, maybe even happiness. We started talking, and it was like we'd known each other for years. Lydia was sharp, witty, and seemed to have this endless curiosity about the world. We talked about books, travel, and even about arts, something I never imagined discussing with anyone in that room. She had a way of listening that made me feel like I was the only person in the world, like what I had to say actually mattered. After that night, We started seeing each other regularly. Dinners, late-night conversations, stolen moments that became the best parts of my day. I fell fast and hard, caught up in everything she was: her kindness, her elegance, her intelligence. She was so different from Eleanor and Robert, so genuine and warm. When she laughed at my jokes, or when she'd reach across the table to touch my hand, it felt like maybe, just maybe, I could be happy again. That she was the one I'd been waiting for. Months passed and every day, I found myself more in love with her. She knew the parts of me no one else had ever seen, my dreams and my fears. And when she looked at me, I felt like I could be that person, the man my father wanted me to be, the one who could lead our family someday. Eventually, I knew I didn't want to go another day without her by my side. So, on a crisp autumn evening, I took her to a quiet corner of the park where we'd first walked together, knelt down, and asked her to marry me. She said yes with tears in her eyes, and I felt like I'd finally found my place. I was certain she was my future, my chance to make something beautiful out of the life I'd been given. For the first time everything felt right. I had no idea then just how wrong I was. As I dangled from the edge of the cliff, my fingers clawing desperately into the cold, unforgiving rock, their voices drifted down to me like a twisted melody. Eleanor, Robert, and Lydia. They stood there just a few feet away, looking down with cruel satisfaction, their expressions a horrifying mix of amusement and impatience. The wind whipped around me, stinging my face, but it was nothing compared to the agony of their words. "Did you really think your father's death was natural, Alex?" Eleanor's voice rang out smooth and venomous. "You poor, trusting fool. He was in our way, just like you are now." Her words cut through me, searing into my mind with a new kind of pain. My father's death, sudden, shocking, and something I had barely recovered from, had been anything but natural. I had mourned him, leaned on Eleanor and Robert for support, trusted them, even thanked them for helping me through it. And all along, they'd been the ones who had stolen him from me. My grip faltered and I let out a cry, looking up at them, desperation and disbelief etched across my face. "No. No, that can't be. Why would you?" Robert smirked, stepping closer to the edge, his eyes gleaming with contempt. "You really are clueless, aren't you, little brother? Everything he left behind, the estate, the business, the money, it should have been ours. But he gave it all to you. All we had to do was remove a few obstacles to get what we deserved." I was gasping now, tears blurring my vision as the full weight of their betrayal crashed over me. My father taken from me by these people, people I had considered family, people I had trusted. And then Lydia stepped forward, her voice as cold as ice. "You never questioned why I was so interested in you, did you, Alex?" She sneered, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "You got I loved you, that I wanted a life with you. But it was all an act. Robert and we've been together for years. The only reason I got close to you was because you were the key to everything we wanted." My heart shattered. Lydia, the woman I had loved with everything I had been playing me all along. Every smile, every laugh, every tender word, it was all a lie. She had used me, taken my love and twisted it, feeding my own feelings back to me while scheming with my own family to bring me down. "No. Please, Lydia," I choked out, my voice breaking as I begged, "don't do this. Don't kill me. Please." But they just laughed, their cold, hollow laughter echoing across the cliffside, mingling with the wind. I could feel my grip slipping, my fingers raw and bloody from clinging so desperately to the rocks. Anger bubbled up in me, burning hotter than my fear, and I found myself screaming up at them. "You monsters! How could you? After everything. After all I gave. I trusted you." I spat, my voice trembling with rage and despair. "You'll pay for this. You'll all pay." But they only looked down with smirks and mocking eyes, unfazed by my curses, unmoved by my pleas. To them, I was nothing more than an obstacle, a final hurdle standing between them and my father's legacy. And now, as my strength failed and my grip loosened, they watched with a sick anticipation, waiting for me to fall. I refused to give up. The anger surged through me, igniting a fire that drowned out the fear and the pain. I couldn't, no, I wouldn't let them win. I had to avenge my father, to make them pay for what they had done. My fingers, slick with blood and sweat, gripped the jagged rock as I tried to push myself up inch by painful inch. My muscles screamed in protest, but I forced my body to move, refusing to let them see my weakness, refusing to let them take everything from me. You think you can escape, Alex? Lydia's voice was dripping with contempt, but I ignored her, focusing only on the sound of my breath, the determination building inside me. But then, just as I thought I might be able to pull myself over the edge, something heavy and sharp struck my hand. I screamed, the pain shooting through my arm as Lydia in her damned high heels stomped down on my fingers with a force I never imagined possible. My entire body jolted with agony, but I refused to let go. No, I wouldn't let them win. Let go, Alex, Robert sneered from above. It's over. You never had a chance. I gritted my teeth, feeling the weight of Lydia's heel pressing down harder, but still, I fought. My vision blurred with tears, my arms trembling with exhaustion, yet I clenched my jaw and refused to let go. The world seemed to fade, and the darkness closed in around me, but I fought against it. I had to keep fighting, I had to survive. But after what felt like an eternity of desperate struggle, the unbearable weight of Lydia's foot finally forced my hand to loosen. I couldn't hold on anymore. I watched helpless as my grip faltered, fingers slipping one by one from the rock's cold surface. The cliff's edge grew farther away, and the ground below seemed to pull me into its depths, a terrifying chasm waiting to consume me. My body tumbled, falling faster than I could process. The world around me turned into a blur of darkness, the pain in my hands and arms growing into a scream that ripped from my chest. I felt like I was falling into an abyss, like the very earth was swallowing me whole, and no matter how much I screamed, no matter how much I cursed my fate, it wouldn't stop. I'm a fool, I muttered through gritted teeth, my voice a rasping whisper against the wind. A damn fool. I failed my father. I couldn't save myself. Couldn't avenge him. As I plummeted, time seemed to stretch and warp, like every second was a year of my life flashing before my eyes. The agony, the despair, the bitter taste of betrayal, all of it merged into an overwhelming sense of defeat. My body felt weightless, but every inch of me was bruised by the cruelty of fate. And just as I thought everything would end in darkness, a blinding light pierced through the abyss. It was like the sun itself had suddenly burst into existence, enveloping me in its brilliance. For a moment, I thought I might be dead, that this was the end, but the light didn't burn, it didn't blind me with pain. Instead, it filled me with warmth, with clarity, as though something ancient and powerful was reaching into my soul, offering me another chance. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand why this light was surrounding me, but I didn't care. Somehow, I felt different, stronger. The overwhelming darkness that had taken hold of my thoughts receded, and in its place, something new, something powerful began to grow inside me. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't done. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, everything was unclear. My head felt heavy, and I couldn't seem to focus on anything. It was as if I had just woken from a long dark tunnel. The kind of tunnel I thought I'd never escape from. But now, I could see. Slowly, things started coming into focus. The darkness was fading and the confusion began to lift, piece by piece. I was lying on something hard, cold even, definitely not the cliffside I had been hanging from moments ago. No, this wasn't the end. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. I was in a classroom. A high school classroom, to be specific. The kind of place I hadn't seen in years. The desk beneath my head was chipped and old, and I could smell the familiar mix of chalk dust and stale air. For a second, I thought I might still be dreaming. I must have been. But the tightness in my chest, the pain in my limbs told me otherwise. This felt all too real. What the hell is happening? My voice sounded hoarse, like I had been screaming for hours. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what had just happened. Before I could make sense of any of it, I heard that voice. Hey, you alright, loser? I froze. That voice. It was Felix. Felix of all people. The one who used to torment me in high school. And there he was standing above me, sneering down at me just like the good old days, wearing that same obnoxious uniform. A cold shiver ran through me. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. My eyes flickered down, and that's when I realized I was wearing my old high school uniform too. The exact one I wore back then. The same one I hated, the same one that felt like a prison back then. But now, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. I was back before everything had fallen apart. Back before Eleanor and Robert had entered my life. Before my father had died. Before the betrayal. I couldn't make sense of it. Was this a dream? A nightmare? Was I really back? Was I reborn somehow? I didn't get much time to dwell on it because Felix, oblivious as ever, moved to strike me, just like he used to. Instinct kicked in. Without thinking, I shot my hand out and grabbed his wrist, twisting it with an unexpected force. It was like my body was on autopilot reacting without my permission. Felix was thrown back, stumbling before crashing to the floor with a yelp. I stood there, breathing heavily, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Confusion clawed at me. My head felt like it was about to explode. What is going on? Why am I here? How? Then, through the haze, I saw him. Eric. My friend. Standing there beside me, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Concern. Amusement. Maybe a bit of both. What day is it? He asked, a slight grin on his face. But I could hear the confusion in his voice too. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure I even understood the question. My mind was still scrambling. But Eric didn't seem to wait for an answer. He looked around, as if checking something, then answered his own question. It's 2015. January 22nd. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. 2015. That was 9 years ago. 9 years before everything had gone to hell. Before Eleanor had entered my life, before Robert and his sick games, before my father's death. I didn't know what to think. What to feel. But one thing was clear, I was back. Somehow, against all odds, I was back in my high school years, before it all went wrong. I stood there in stunned silence trying to comprehend the impossible. But before I could gather my guts, Felix, who had been thrown back, was already recovering, charging back at me with a look of rage in his eyes. And before I could react, he kicked me. The pain was sharp and real. That was it. The final confirmation. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't in some twisted fantasy. I was alive. And more than that, I was back to when everything had started, before Eleanor and Robert had poisoned my life. Before they had destroyed everything I loved. I stumbled back, the kick still stinging, my head spinning with 1,000 thoughts. But one thing stood out, I had a second chance. A chance to stop it all. To make sure that my father didn't die. To make sure I didn't fall into the trap they had set for me. I could feel the weight of it all, the pain, the loss, the regret. But in this moment, as I stood there in my high school uniform, I realized something. I was back. Back to a time before everything had gone wrong. Before Eleanor and Robert had wormed their way into my life and ruined everything I held dear. This was my second chance. My chance to do things differently, to change the course of my future. I wouldn't let history repeat itself. I wasn't that same timid, shy, bullied boy anymore. That version of me, weak, naive, silent, was gone. Gone forever. In my previous life after my father died, I changed. I wasn't the nerdy, quiet boy anymore. I became someone else. Someone fueled by rage, someone who threw punches just to feel alive. I picked up a lot of things in the years after my father's death, how to fight, how to defend myself. Back then it was all about survival, trying to forget the pain by distracting myself with anything that gave me control. But that control came with a cost. I became a hot-tempered boy who picked fights and lived in anger. It wasn't who I really was, but it was who I had to become to survive in a world that had no place for the weak. And now I had the chance to change that. I could stop the path I had walked down. I wouldn't let myself be bullied anymore. That ended now. I knew what to do to protect myself. The knowledge I'd gained after my father's death was going to help me reshape my life. The world around me might not change, but I would. This school, The one I used to dread going to was different now. It was the top school in the city, filled with the children of the richest families, kids who were born with silver spoons in their mouths, and those who had earned their place here with pure talent. I had once walked these halls with my head down, always avoiding confrontation, hiding my true self because I didn't want anyone to know who I really was. My father, the wealthiest man in the city, had never come to my school, never gotten involved in my life here. I always kept him distant, afraid of disturbing him with my problems. And that was the mistake. That distance gave Eleanor and Robert the opening they needed to take advantage of me. They were able to charm my father, slip into his life, and slowly poison everything we had. But no more. I knew now that if I had ever spoken up, if I had ever shown my father what was really happening, he would have put a stop to it. No one would have dared to bully me. But I had been too silent, too scared. I thought being quiet would keep the peace, keep my father happy. Instead, it gave them room to take everything from me. Robert, he was the worst of all. He was the one who'd been bullying me behind my back, pretending to be my friend. He'd made me believe we were brothers, that he was my protector. I had trusted him. But in the end, he was the one encouraging the bullies, the one manipulating me from the shadows, and I only found out at the end, the bitter end, when it was too late. But not now. Now, I could change it all. I thought about my father's death. About how I let things go on without stepping in. I thought about how I'd been too busy trying to get revenge on Robert and Eleanor for everything they'd done. But revenge alone wouldn't fix anything. I didn't want that life anymore. I had a chance to rebuild, to live a better life with my father. I wasn't going to waste it on hatred and vengeance. I wasn't going to live in the past anymore. I was going to protect my father, protect myself, and steer clear of the people who would drag me down. I would get rid of them, but I wouldn't let them define my life. If Eleanor, Robert, and my stepmother tried to come for me, they would regret it. I wouldn't let them get away with it this time. I would make them pay the price for everything they tried to do to me. But I wasn't going to chase them down in blind anger. I would be smart. I would control the situation, not let them control me. And most of all, I would live for myself, live for my father, and live for a future where I didn't have to fear the past repeating itself. I was no longer the timid boy. I wasn't going to let anyone walk over me again. And if they tried to destroy everything again, I'd be ready. I'd make them wish they never crossed me. But for now, I would focus on what mattered, my life. The final bell of the day rang, and I didn't waste a second. For once, I wasn't going to just slink home in silence. I pulled out my phone, dialing my butler's number. I never did things like this before, so I could practically hear his surprise through the pause on the line when I asked, "Can you send a car to pick me up?" When the car finally arrived, I walked straight past the stares from my classmates and slid into the back seat, feeling a jolt of impatience and determination. I leaned forward, tapping the driver's shoulder. "Is my father home yet?" I asked, even though I had a feeling he wasn't. The driver gave a slight shake of his head. "Your father is still at the office, sir. He's in a meeting, and probably won't be home until later." I hesitated, then nodded. "Take me to the company, then." I could see the driver glance back in the mirror, surprised. I almost wanted to laugh at how bizarre this must seem to him, but I wasn't joking. I needed to see my father. As we pulled up in front of the company building, I felt a strange thrill. This was new territory for me. People glanced my way, looking shocked as I walked into the lobby, like they couldn't quite believe I was actually there. I headed straight to my dad's office and found his secretary standing outside. He looked almost as shocked as everyone else. "Alex, what are you doing here?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm here to see my dad," I said, trying to sound casual. "Is he in his office?" "He's getting ready for a meeting," the secretary replied, looking a bit hesitant. "But yes, he's alone in his office at the moment." I didn't wait. I marched up to the door and gave a firm knock. When I heard my dad's voice from inside, I felt a rush of emotions that caught me off guard. I swung the door open and walked in, my dad's eyes widening in surprise as he looked up at me. Without thinking, I crossed the room and threw my arms around him, clinging to him with all the strength I had. I didn't care how ridiculous I must have looked. "Dad," I whispered, feeling my throat tighten, "I missed you. I love you." He froze, then slowly hugged me back, his surprise melting into warmth. For the first time, I could feel how much he cared, something I had ignored or taken for granted until he was gone. Just then his secretary poked his head in and reminded him the meeting was about to start. My dad started to pull away, but I tightened my grip for just a second longer. I looked up at him with what must have been the most pitiful, desperate expression. "Can I join you?" I asked, surprising even myself with the question. "You really want to?" he asked, clearly taken aback. "I want to help you," I said, a bit shyly. "I want to learn what you do. I want to spend more time with you." He stared at me for a second, then gave a small nod, his face softening. "All right, then. Come on. Let's go." We walked into the meeting room together, and I could feel every pair of eyes land on us. I'd never been here before, and they all knew it. But I kept my head up and moved with purpose. I wasn't going to let them see the nerves buzzing under my skin. Dad took his seat at the head of the table, and I sat beside him, folding my hands on the table and trying to look like I belonged. The directors exchanged curious glances, clearly wondering why I was here. I didn't care. I wasn't just Alex the high school kid anymore. I was Alex, the son of a man I respected, someone who'd lost everything and had been given a second chance. This time, I was going to make it count. The meeting began, and I listened closely to every word. The discussions were intense, full of numbers, projections, and plans that went over my head. But I focused, determined to absorb as much as I could. I could feel my dad occasionally glance at me, probably wondering what had come over me. Halfway through, one of the directors looked directly at me, a hint of a smirk on his face. "So, Alex," he said, as if testing me, "are you interested in the family business? Planning to help your father with all this?" Without hesitating, I nodded. "Yes," I replied, meeting his gaze squarely. "I want to learn everything I can. I want to help my dad, and I want to make sure I'm ready to protect what's ours." The words came out more determined than I'd intended, but I meant every one of them. The director looked a bit taken aback, but he nodded almost approvingly. The meeting continued, and I kept my focus. By the end, I felt mentally drained, but somehow satisfied. This was a start, a small step toward becoming the person who could stand beside my father, who could be trusted with everything he had worked for. When the meeting wrapped up, Dad turned to me, a proud, surprised look in his eyes. "You did well," he said, patting my shoulder. "I'm impressed, Alex." Those words were more valuable than any praise I'd received before. After I got home, I couldn't just sit back and let things unfold like before. The more I got about it, the more I realized how little I truly knew about Eleanor and Robert before they entered our lives. Eleanor, from what Dad had told me, was just a clerk at his company. There was that so-called accident where she'd happened to be there, supposedly rescuing him in a moment of need. Grateful, Dad had felt indebted to her, and when he learned that she was a single mother struggling to raise her son Robert, he saw it as a chance to give me a complete family. But now, with what I knew, it was hard not to question everything. Had that accident been staged? Was their entire appearance in our lives calculated? If my memory served me right, the accident and Eleanor's involvement were only 2 months away from now. I couldn't afford to wait and see if it would play out the same way. So I made a call and hired a private detective to start digging up every detail about Eleanor and Robert, where they went, who they spoke to, any hint of past connections or unusual behavior. I wanted eyes on them both, following their movements and uncovering anything suspicious. If they had conspired back then, I'd find out now, and make sure history didn't repeat itself. And Lydia. She was still out there too. But this time, I'd keep her at a distance. I wasn't going to fall into her trap again, and I'd make sure that she wouldn't get close enough to do any damage. With the detective's findings, I finally saw the twisted game Robert had been playing. At school, I kept my identity low-key, never flaunting my status as the heir to Daniel's group. Most of my classmates, including Felix, thought of me as just an ordinary rich kid from an unknown wealthy family, nothing close to influential. It was this assumption that Robert had exploited to his advantage. Under my father's name, Robert was impersonating me, posing as the heir of Daniel's group, and he befriended Felix by weaving himself into a role that wasn't his to claim. Felix, oblivious to the truth, saw Robert as someone powerful and valuable. Meanwhile, I stayed in the shadows, letting people underestimate me. But that was about to change. A few days before the annual banquet at my family's estate, Felix confronted me near the lockers looking smug. He had no idea who I truly was, and Robert had probably encouraged him to keep up his usual antics toward me. You know, he started with a sly grin, I'm heading to Daniel Grubb's banquet this weekend. I got an invitation from his son himself, Robert. It's going to be an exclusive event. Not everyone gets in, you know. His words struck a nerve. The audacity of Robert to use my identity to get close to people like Felix, while making sure I was kept out of the loop, was infuriating. In my past life, I hadn't even been able to attend the banquet. Felix had beaten me up so badly right before the event that I'd been too embarrassed and bruised to show my face there. But now, things were different. This time, I was ready. Oh, I wouldn't be so sure about who's exclusive or not, I replied, holding his gaze with a calm smile. Felix's smirk faded a bit, but he shrugged it off. Whatever you say, Alex. Enjoy being on the outside while Robert and I take over the real action. The banquet day arrived. I showed up in my finest suit, my true identity as Daniel Grubb's heir fully intact. When I walked through the grand hall, I noticed the surprise on some of my classmates' faces, including Felix's. He hadn't expected to see me there, much less dressed and acting like someone who belonged. Robert, who was already mingling and soaking up attention, saw me and froze for a split second, a look of shock quickly masked by a fake smile. But I caught it. He hadn't expected me to show up, much less reveal my true connection to the family. The evening continued, with Felix and a few others glancing my way, visibly curious but unsure what to make of it. Then, as I took a seat beside my father at the head table, realization dawned on Felix's face. This was it, the moment he'd see me for who I really was. When my father introduced me as his son, the true heir of Daniel's group, I glanced over at Felix, watching the shock ripple through him. The look on Felix's face was priceless. Here he was assuming he'd been aligned with the real heir, only to discover that he'd been duped by Robert all along. And now, Robert, standing in the crowd, couldn't avoid the whispers that were starting to spread. Certainly. Let's craft the dramatic sequence where Felix uncovers Robert's impersonation in the banquet, realizing that Alex is the true heir and that Robert had been deceiving everyone, including him. Alex, meanwhile, is already planning to tell his father about Robert's impersonation, ensuring that even if Eleanor tries to manipulate Daniel, Robert will never gain his favor. The banquet hall buzzed with conversation, the atmosphere now tense after Daniel Grubb's grand announcement of Alex's true position as the vice president of Grubb Enterprises. Felix and his friends, who had mocked Alex just moments earlier, stood in shock. Felix couldn't comprehend what was happening. The kid he had been tormenting, the one they'd all laughed at for claiming to be Daniel Grubb's son, was the real heir. As the applause for Alex died down, Felix's disbelief quickly turned into frustration. The humiliation he had been dishing out to Alex for weeks now seemed petty, childish, completely wrong. But Felix wasn't about to let go of his pride just yet. He scanned the room, looking for an escape from the situation, but then he saw it. There, across the room, was Robert, standing with his usual smug expression. Robert, the charming, confident young man who had ingratiated himself into their circle, who had convinced Felix and others that he was the heir to the Grubb empire. Robert had been the one who had laughed at Alex alongside him, the one who had filled Felix's ears with lies about Alex's supposed delusions. Felix's mind began to race. He turned to look at Robert more closely, and in that moment, something clicked in his mind. He saw the familiar, fake smile Robert wore, the same one he had used to cover his own insecurities. Robert's perfect act had been a carefully constructed lie, but the truth was now being exposed. Felix took a few hesitant steps toward Robert, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. "Robert," he muttered, barely able to keep his composure. You knew, didn't you?" Robert's face flickered with a moment of panic, but he quickly masked it with a laugh. What are you talking about, Felix? Robert said, feigning innocence. You've had too much to drink. Just relax. Felix's heart pounded in his chest. His voice shook, but there was no turning back now. Stop pretending. You knew Alex was the real heir, and all this time you've been pretending to be him. You've been lying to all of us. He gestured wildly, causing several nearby guests to look over in confusion. Alex, who had been standing beside his father, watching the scene unfold, knew the time had come. He had been waiting for the right moment to expose Robert's true identity and finally set the record straight. Robert, Alex said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. I think it's time you stop pretending to be me. Felix turned toward Alex, his eyes widening in shock as the pieces finally clicked into place. What? What do you mean, Alex? Felix stammered, his confidence shattered. This guy. He pointed at Robert. He's been pretending to be you. Felix's voice cracked as he struggled to comprehend the truth. Alex nodded, his gaze fixed firmly on Robert. Yes. Robert's been living a lie. He's been impersonating me, taking advantage of my name and my position. You've been deceived, Felix. Robert tried to recover, but it was too late. The whispers in the room had already started. Guests who had once welcomed him with open arms were now looking at him with suspicion. His perfect act was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Felix stood frozen for a moment, his mind spinning. No. No way. He looked between Alex and Robert, as if trying to find some explanation that would allow him to keep his world intact. But you've always been so perfect, Robert. You've got the looks, the charm, how could you? It's all a facade, Alex said, stepping closer. And I'm done letting him get away with it. Felix felt a cold rush of realization hit him. Everything he had believed about Robert, everything that had made him trust him, was a lie. He had been fooled by Robert's charm, his smooth words, and his clever manipulation. But now that the truth was out, Felix could see it all so clearly. He looked back at Alex, his face a mixture of regret and frustration. So, all this time, you've been the one. Felix's voice lowered almost in disbelief. And I've been worshipping the wrong person. Alex simply nodded. That's right. The room was now electric with whispers. Everyone had begun to piece together the drama unfolding before them. Felix, who had spent so much time mocking Alex, now stood exposed, realizing the depths of his mistake. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Robert's true colors were now fully revealed. The final blow, Robert's fall. As Felix stood there, dumbfounded and humiliated, Alex turned toward his father, Daniel. Alex knew that it was finally time to tell him everything, the truth about Robert's impersonation and how Robert had been taking advantage of Alex's absence. He had already planned to confront Robert, but now, with the truth out in the open, he knew he had to make sure his father knew exactly what kind of person Robert was. But just as Alex was about to speak, Felix in his panic shouted out one last attempt to save face. Wait. Robert is the real grub heir. Felix cried out, the words tumbling from his mouth without thinking. He was the one we were all looking up to. Not him. Felix pointed at Alex with a finger shaking with fear. The room went silent as Felix's words hung in the air, and Robert, who had been trying to salvage his position, realized his attempt to keep the lie alive was over. His composure cracked, and in an instant it was clear to everyone in the room, Felix was the last person to know the truth. The tension in the room thickened as Daniel Grubb, standing beside his son, narrowed his eyes in disgust at Robert. His voice was cold, a sharp edge to it as he addressed the impostor. Robert, Daniel said, his gaze unwavering, your game is over. Before Robert could even attempt to defend himself, security moved in swiftly, escorting him out of the banquet hall. His desperate cries echoed as he was dragged out, the once charming impostor reduced to nothing but a liar exposed for all to see. As the crowd whispered, Alex turned to his father, their eyes locking. Alex knew the truth had finally come to light, and no matter what Eleanor or anyone else tried, Robert's facade was shattered forever. The banquet had ended in chaos, but as the dust settled, Alex found himself standing in a quieter corner of the mansion. The guests had dispersed, but the tension in the air remained thick. Daniel Grubb, his father, stood beside him, looking at his son with an expression that was both approving and thoughtful. "Alex," Daniel said with a rare, sincere smile, "you handled that matter with Robert far better than I could have imagined. You are calm, composed. It's clear to me now that you're ready for the responsibilities ahead." Alex smiled faintly, grateful for the acknowledgement. His father had been distant for so long, but in this moment, Alex felt a certain warmth in his words, a connection that had been lacking before. He was starting to see his father not just as a businessman but as a father who cared, even if it was in his own way. However, as Alex's smile faded, a somber thought crept into his mind. This wasn't over yet. Eleanor and her schemes were still looming over him, and now was the right time to expose the truth. "Thank you, Dad," Alex replied, his voice steady but a hint of something more serious underlying it. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There's something else I need to tell you, something I've uncovered during my investigations over the past few months." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on," he urged, his demeanor still relaxed but attentive. Alex took a deep breath and decided to tell his father everything he had discovered about Eleanor, everything that had been hidden behind the smile and charm of the woman who had been trying to manipulate their lives for years. He knew it was time to shed light on the darkness that surrounded her. "I've been looking into Robert's background," Alex began, his voice steady but full of the weight of what he was about to reveal. "And while doing that, I uncovered something even more disturbing. Robert's mother, Eleanor. She's been involved in a lot of shady business. She's been working with Robert, but it's more than that. She's been using him as a pawn in a game she's been playing against us, the Grubb family." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing where this was going, but he remained silent, letting Alex speak. "Eleanor's background is a lot darker than anyone realizes. I did some digging and found out that she's not just a socialite or someone with connections. She used to be a clerk in the Grubb office. And not just any clerk, she was a low-level employee who had access to confidential information. Over the years, she managed to climb her way up the social ladder by manipulating people, including some key figures in our company. She's been using Robert as a tool to push her own agenda to worm her way into the Grubb family by any means necessary." Daniel's face remained expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. "You're telling me Eleanor, she was a clerk?" Alex nodded. "Yes. But that's not all. She's been feeding Robert false information, encouraging his lies, and orchestrating this whole plan to make it seem like he was the true heir to the Grubb empire. She had him pretending to be me, all while trying to manipulate everyone into believing that he was the son of the Grubb legacy." Alex's words were beginning to carry the weight of the years of deceit he had uncovered. He could see the shift in his father's expression, the subtle signs of anger and disbelief creeping in. "But why would she go to such lengths?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with a growing sense of realization. Alex took a deep breath before continuing. "It's because she wants to control everything: the company, the wealth, and most importantly, our family name. She's been using Robert to get close to you to gain influence over the Grubb enterprises. And it's not just for herself. She wants to build a network of allies in the company and manipulate anyone who could help her climb even higher. She got that by replacing me with Robert, she could control your decisions and secure her own power in the family business." Daniel clenched his jaw, his expression hardening with every word. "So, she's been lying all along. Using Robert as her puppet to get close to me and take control of everything." His voice was laced with disgust. "And all these years, I've trusted her." Alex nodded grimly. "Exactly. But that's not all. I've also found out that Eleanor's been involved in illegal dealings. She's used the company's resources to fund her own ventures and manipulated some of our most trusted employees to cover up her tracks. I'm still gathering evidence, but I've seen enough to know that she's been pulling the strings behind the scenes for far too long." The room was silent for a long moment. Daniel stood still, processing everything Alex had just revealed. His son had been investigating not just Robert, but the very person who had been under his nose for years, Eleanor, the woman he had trusted. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low, but filled with a sense of resolve. I can't believe this. All these years, I've been blind to everything she's been doing. But you, Alex. You've been paying attention. You've been looking out for our family, for the company. Alex felt a slight weight lift off his shoulders as he heard his father's approval. I've been trying to do what's right, Dad. And I think it's time we put a stop to Eleanor's games. She needs to face the consequences of her actions. Daniel's eyes darkened with anger, his protective instinct for his family rising. I'll take care of it. But you did the right thing by bringing this to my attention. Eleanor has gone too far and she won't be allowed to manipulate me, or anyone in this family, ever again. Alex's heart raced as he saw the determination in his father's eyes. This was the moment where everything changed. He had exposed the truth about Robert and Eleanor, and now, his father was going to take action. We'll handle this together, Daniel added, his tone resolute. But you've proven today that you're more than ready for the responsibilities ahead. You're not just my son, Alex. You're someone I can trust to lead this company into the future. After the banquet, everything changed. My identity as the heir of Daniel Group was exposed, and the school, once indifferent, now saw me in a completely different light. Whispers followed me everywhere, but I didn't mind. I knew the truth, and so did my father. He had seen the evidence I had gathered, the details of Eleanor's schemes, her rise from a lowly clerk to a position of power through manipulation and fraud. The embezzling of company funds, the underhanded tactics she had used to get ahead, it was all laid bare. Out of his fury, my father pressed charges against her. I watched as Eleanor was sentenced to prison, the consequences of her greed and betrayal catching up to her. It was a moment of justice, but also a heavy reminder of how far some people were willing to go for power. With her behind bars, Robert's world came crashing down. His role in impersonating me was now a known fact, and the humiliation was unbearable. Not just in the high society circles, but in the school as well. He was ostracized, shunned, and left to fend for himself. His mother gone, his reputation shattered, he had no one. He was just a stray, lost and alone. Meanwhile, I continued with my life, helping my father with the business and building something new. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to leave the past behind. But I wasn't blind to the consequences of what had transpired. A few weeks later, I heard the news about Robert. He had turned to illegal activities to make money, selling drugs and engaging in even worse crimes. In the end, he stabbed someone in a fit of rage, and now he was behind bars, facing the full extent of his actions. He couldn't run from his past anymore, not when the law finally caught up with him. As for Lydia, she never entered my life in this new life. In the past, she had come to me after my father's death, playing her part in the carefully orchestrated plan by Robert, Eleanor, and herself. But not this time. They had been exposed, their manipulations laid bare. I had no need for her in this life. She had no place here. Lydia, with all her pretensions and her messy background, had a history I knew too well. Her stepfather, a drunkard and gambler, had caused nothing but trouble. In the previous life, I had been the one to help her, to take her out of the misery she was stuck in. But in the end, she had betrayed me, throwing it all away for selfish gain. And now, in this life, I refuse to extend a hand to her. It wasn't out of spite, but out of self-respect. She had chosen her path, and I chose mine. Without my help, Lydia eventually descended into the abyss.